In this session, we're going to take a look at how sensor size has a really important effect on the effective focal length of the lenses that you're using in conjunction with a particular camera system. Now, sensor sizes can come in a number of different dimensions. They'll often maintain the same ratio, which happens to be 3:2, which gives you this nice long rectangular shape, which I think lends itself very nicely to interiors, particularly real estate. But your sensor size could be different dimensions depending on the system that you're using. This picture was taken with a full frame sensor. Now, full frame sensor harks back to the days of 35mm film format, and it happens to be 36mm along the long dimension and 24mm along the short dimension. And if you divide those numbers by 12, you get a ratio of 3:2. That's the rather nice slightly long rectangular form. So the 3:2 ratio has become something of a standard. Now, that's a full frame sensor. Your APS-C size sensor may well be considerably smaller. It might maintain the same ratio of 3:2, but it might be 28 by 19 or even smaller than that. And this has a really big effect on the apparent focal length of the lens that you're using. I'm going to go back to the full frame sensor here. How do you know how your lenses are going to behave with a particular size sensor? Well, working with a full frame sensor, we know that it's 36mm long by 24 short, and the really critical dimension to take note of is what the diagonal measurement of your sensor is. And on a full frame sensor, that comes out at 43mm. And what that means is that a 43mm lens will give a fairly standard perspective when you're shooting a subject. So for a natural looking perspective that kind of matches what your eyes see, a standard lens on a full frame sensor is nominally 43mm. And actually in practice, the 50mm lens has become the sort of chosen preferred standard lens for this format, but actually 43 is more accurate. So around that area, 43 to 50 is a nice standard focal length on the full frame sensor. But how about different focal lengths? I find it's a useful exercise to halve that dimension. If you wanted to know what a really good wide angle lens was going to be, if you halve that, you get 21, 22. And so a super wide lens, you'd want it to be about half the diagonal dimension of your sensor. So in full frame terms, that comes out as about a 21mm lens, which is a really nice focal length for shooting interiors, I've found. If you want to go ultra wide, then you're on this format, then you're coming down to the 14s, the 17s. 14 is about a third of that measurement, so that's getting pretty wide. Conversely, if you wanted to go to a telephoto setting, let's say you wanted to shoot a nice head and shoulders portrait, you don't want to get too close to somebody because that creates distortion. Telephoto would be an 85 or an 86 because that's going to be double the diagonal measurement of the sensor. So that, I hope, shows the relationship between that really important measurement and the lenses you're using. If you remember that the actual measurement itself will give you a standard equivalent lens. So in calculating what wide angle lens you might need for an interior shot, you're probably looking at something that's 50% of that dimension. So let's say you don't have a full frame camera and you've got one of the APS-C size sensors. These really can vary. They can be anything. So it's quite difficult to predict what your lenses are going to, what the equivalent lenses you're going to need. If you can get the dimensions of the sensor, and in this case I've picked out there's a sensor, it's 28 by 19. And I've just drawn this out on paper and I simply measured what the diagonal can be. The mathematicians amongst you can calculate what they call the hypotenuse. I prefer a ruler and paper. And I've come up with 34 millimeters is that all-important diagonal dimension. So on this sensor size, my standard lens would actually be something more like a 34 or 35. So you can see that if you were to use a 50 lens, which would be kind of standard for a full frame camera, on this size sensor, it's actually going to be a little bit more telephoto. And that's when dealers talk about your lenses having a crop factor of 1.6 or 1.5. You're actually making your lenses a little more telephoto. If you were to use a 68 or a 70mm lens on this format, that's almost double the diagonal of the format. So it would actually be quite a telephoto lens, a 68. Whereas on a full frame sensor, that wouldn't be quite so telephoto as an 86, for example. But if we're talking real estate and interiors here, and you're shooting with an APS-C sized sensor, what would be really useful here, a super wide lens would actually be much wider than a super wide lens for full frame. You'd be down to something like 17, because 17 is half 34. It's giving you 50% of that dimension. It's going to be a nice wide field of vision. If you wanted to go really ultra wide, you're down into the 10 to 12s. I think the Tokina or the Sigma lens, that nice zoom lens that they do, will take you right down to that those really small numbers. And again, that's, you know, 10 to 12 is about a third of your diagonal measurement. So to look at these in practice, that's my shot with on a full frame with my 17mm lens. If I was to use that 17mm lens on an APS-C size sensor, I'm going to get a crop factor like that. So I would need to go to something like a 10 or 11 focal length to get that nice wide field of vision that I get on that format. So that's, I hope, shows the relationship between the diagonal of your frame, whatever sensor you're using, is going to dictate how telephoto or how wide angle your lenses are going to become. And manufacturers will quote the focal length of a lens assuming you're shooting on full frame 35mm in those terms. So if you ask for a standard lens and you're actually using an APS-C size sensor, that standard lens is going to come out a little more telephoto. And a word of caution, if you decide to upgrade to full format one day, you may find that some of these super wide, ultra wide lenses that you get that sufficiently cover the small APS-C size sensor, they may not be good enough, or in terms of edge detail, to cover the full bigger area of the full frame. So it's a tough choice in terms of your budget. If you think this is interiors photography is going to be a long-term thing, then I think going full frame ultimately is quite a good move, although it is more expensive. To take this a little bit further, and this doesn't apply always so much to real estate photography, but more to architecture and interiors photography, a lot of pictures, particularly if you're shooting for magazines, are in portrait format. And my personal feeling is that the portrait format is well, if you turn your 35mm frame into portrait mode, it's a little bit too tall, and I much prefer what they call a sort of 4:3 ratio. So I've set up in Lightroom here a crop preset of 4:3, and I very often crop my my portrait format images to something like that. That's actually kind of in proportion to an A4 magazine, and it's editors really like to be able to use portrait format images in a series of pictures. But if we go back to a sensor diagram and see what's happening here, I've got my 36mm by 24mm full frame sensor, and I'm actually lopping off a bit of information in order to give me a slightly squarer rectangular crop, my 4:3 crop is actually 32mm by 24. So that's it's just slightly more in proportion to the magazine that I'm shooting for, and that's changed the diagonal of the frame from 43 to 40. It's not a huge leap, but it does mean that the lenses that I'm using become a little more telephoto. So the standard lens for that format would actually be 40. A telephoto would be 80, because that's double. If I really want to get a wide angle and I know that I'm going to be shooting in this slightly cropped format, I'm looking for something, a focal length that's half that, I'd be down to about 20. Whereas perhaps on the full format I might have shot at 24. So it's a way to predict, if I know I'm going to be shooting this type of picture, I kind of know what lenses I'm going to have to reach for in the bag to give me that field of vision, that feel of picture that I'm looking for. Now, to go one step further, I sometimes supply pictures in square format, and I know that for the real estate shooters amongst you, this isn't an option, unfortunately, because a lot of the real estate agents' websites will only take landscape format. But I'd ask you to think about the square format for other applications. It's a very nice format, particularly for interiors. It had almost a sort of oddly circular feel to it. It's quite a gentle format, but you can place objects on the intersection of third elements in the picture. It's a format that's worth considering. But of course, by doing that, you're actually chopping off a lot of your frame, which of course limits the degree to which you can enlarge these images. But I'm going down to from a 36mm by 24mm available sensor area down to, of course, my long dimension is going to be 24 and my other dimension is going to be 24, because I'm now on a 1:1 ratio. So if I want a really wide angle lens and I'm shooting square format on my camera, I now know that my diagonal is right down to 34mm. So an ultra wide lens on that, half of 34, is my 17. So I'm actually using my really ultra wide lens that I would normally use on the full frame format, becomes a sort of super wide on this format. And if I wanted to go much wider, I'd have to go down to something like a 14mm lens. But the nice thing about this is that I know that if I want a sort of very natural feeling perspective in an interior shot, I know that when I'm shooting square format, 34 becomes about a standard. So I've got a 35mm prime lens in the bag, and that's a really nice format for some shots. So the key here is that the magic number is the diagonal of whatever format you're using. So if you're taking your full frame sensor and you're chopping bits of it off to get a more selective crop, that's going to change the effective diagonal of your picture area, and that of course has an effect, a reciprocal effect, on the focal length of the lenses that you're using. So my advice is, when you're going out to choose a camera, particularly if you're looking at one of the APS-C size models, find out first of all what are the dimensions of the sensor, and they vary. Draw it out, find out what the diagonal is, and the diagonal will give you a standard focal length for that system. And then when you come to choose your wide angle lenses, find a wide angle lens that gives you half that. And if you really think you're going to be doing some, tight compositions in difficult, hard to get at rooms, think about something that gives you a third of that diagonal.